Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. E rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, e nā iwi e huhui nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ki te kōrero o tēnei wā. Ko Liz MacPherson, ahau, ko Komihana Tuarua, ahau. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Liz MacPherson, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to PrivacyLive. As Deputy Privacy Commissioner, it's been my great privilege to host the last PrivacyLive, where I got the opportunity to put some questions to the previous Privacy Commissioner. This time, it's my really great pleasure to be able to facilitate your introduction to our new Privacy Commissioner, Michael Webster. So with that, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. Now, I've got no doubt that once I've had a bit of a chat with Michael, you'll be wanting to ask your own questions. If you do, please put your questions in the Q&A. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, you have two options, Q&A and chat. Do not put your questions in the chat function if you want me to see them and ask Michael them. I won't see them there. I'll be looking in the Q&A function. By all means, use the chat yourselves, but if you want me to put a question to Michael, please use the Q&A and I'll be able to scroll through those on my laptop here as we get to them. But it is my very great pleasure to, as I said, introduce you to our new Privacy Commissioner, Michael Webster. I've known Michael for quite some time now, worked in and around him, but never actually had the opportunity to work with him. Michael took up the role on the 5th of July. He's 4 weeks into the role now. Michael's previous roles were at, most recently at the Cabinet Office, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He was there for 14 years, and for 8 of those, he held the position of Secretary of the Cabinet and Clerk of the Executive Council, where he reported directly to the Governor-General. Michael's had a really long history of public service and expertise, his expertise in policy development, corporate strategy, and planning and risk management. His career to date is focused on enabling and driving good governance, the promotion of democratic rights and values, the development and application of codes of conduct and behaviour, and then working to ensure compliance with those things. And it's my very great pleasure to give you the chance to get to know him. So, Michael, welcome.
Kia ora, Liz. Thanks so much for the welcome. Kia ora koutou, everyone.
Right, so start off at 10. Why did you want to be the Privacy Commissioner?
Really good question. It's something that I obviously had to think about when the opportunity arose. And Liz, I'm an old student of political philosophy. It's one of the things I studied. It's one of the subject areas that I'm really interested in. And I very much view privacy through that lens, the lens of privacy as one of the human rights that I hold dear. I see privacy as a vital ingredient, a vital component of living in a free and democratic society, as we have here in New Zealand.
And how do you think it underpins that? What does privacy give people the ability to do?
Privacy is very much for me about autonomy, about control, about the ability to make conscious decisions about what you will and won't share about yourself with others. Who we are as people is a particularly personal thing. I know there is a value to be gained in terms of the services offered by public sector agencies, private sector companies, in terms of handing over some of who we are to them in order to access or get services in return. But at the end of the day, that is a very personal and important decision that's made by the people of Aotearoa New Zealand. And I want to be part of an organisation that does its best and that stands up for the rights of all those people.
I'm sure those issues about digital rights will be something we come back to later. Interestingly, you're the second Cabinet Secretary to become Privacy Commissioner after Dame Marie Schroff. what is it about the role of the Cabinet Secretary that makes you think that makes it a good stepping stone for a Privacy Commissioner?
Interesting, interesting reflection. I would like, though, Liz, before I answer that, just to acknowledge those who've gone before me. There have been a series of outstanding New Zealanders who've had the role of Privacy Commissioner. Sir Bruce Lane, Dame Marie Schroff, as you mentioned, John Edwards, of course, who's now in the UK doing a similar role. I'd like to acknowledge you, Liz, for the time that you've spent as Acting Privacy Commissioner as well. For me, and you did a bit of an intro of my career to date, I have very much focused in recent years in the work I do after a long career in public service and local government, working overseas as well. In that intersection of governance, decision-making, democratic rights, and obligations and responsibilities to people, basically. And for me, one of the key areas of focus in doing that work has been about appropriate conduct and behaviour. And in terms of doing that, I've had the opportunity, Liz, on in a number of areas, whether it's local government or central government, to work on developing codes of behaviour, things such as updating the cabinet manual here in central government, codes of conduct in local government. And the importance for me of those is that it sets out clear expectations of appropriate behaviour. And then there's an opportunity, of course, to educate, advise, encourage consistency with those codes, and of course also to hold people to account for their performance against those codes of behaviour. And to me, I can see a strong parallel behind that previous work and the work of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. There's also been, I guess, a thread running through my career of democratic rights and values, of ensuring that the behaviour of people reflects, I guess, the fundamentals of constitutional relationships as well. And to me, when I think about the nature of constitutional relationships, I think about things that we touched on earlier, like around living in a free and democratic society. And as well, as many of us do in our roles, there's been obviously the opportunity to apply statute as well as constitutional conventions and to ensure consistency with those. So lots of parallels, lots of threads that have run through my career.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to teasing into those in terms of your vision for privacy, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. But before we get to that, I'm really interested in what you think are some of the critical issues, or maybe even opportunities, that are facing Aotearoa New Zealand in the privacy space.
Right. I guess there are two or three that are top of mind. The first is to ensure that in our drive to lift service delivery, to improve efficiency and effectiveness, we don't lose sight of the importance of the right to privacy, the right to have personal information about ourselves protected and respected. There is obviously the growing impact of digital technology, digital transformation on that right to privacy. And I think increasingly for those of us who work in the privacy area, as in all areas of government policy, there's the importance of thinking further and considering the Te Ao Māori perspective and perhaps obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi in terms of how we do our jobs, in our case, how we regulate as the Privacy Commissioner. One
of the things that the new Privacy Act put in place was a focus on cultural perspectives, and as the Privacy Commissioner, you'll now have to take cultural perspectives into consideration when you make decisions. How do you feel about that, and how well do you think the officers set up to do this?
I think first of all, I'd acknowledge that there is a sense of energy in the office about embarking on this journey. There is work that we have done, but for all of us in the space, there is more work to be done. I think the recent case of the Whānau Water Commissioning Agency in relation to access to vaccination records of Māori to see whether they've been vaccinated or not, which brought into play considerations about how best to do service delivery for Māori as distinct from the general population, is a really good example of where this office has got involved. Before my time, I know, Liz, but you will recall, we asked to be heard as part of the court case around that, and some really interesting, I guess, decisions and reflections came out of that in terms of the Te Ao Māori view of privacy and the importance of seeing personal information as a taonga for Māori.
Absolutely. So, going back to the issues you raised earlier about the expectations and setting expectations, what is your vision for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner?
Well, it's going to take time. We've got, the exciting opportunity of the provisions of a new act, So we started obviously with our act in 93. In 2020, the new act came to force. I guess there are three things I'd say, Liz. First, I want privacy to be seen as valued by everybody. So I want it to be valued by agencies, by public sector agencies, by private sector companies, but I also want it to be valued by all of us as citizens. We understand that it is a valuable thing that we hold. I want it to be seen as business as usual around the table for private sector companies. There are lots of things that are business as usual for companies, whether it's financial planning and reporting, whether it's service delivery, operations, those sorts of things. I want privacy to be business as usual. It is a core part of the business. And I guess for public sector agencies, public sector agencies are very much driven by principles and values of public service. And I'd like privacy to be seen as one of those core principles and values as well.
Okay, as part of public service. So when you said you wanted privacy to be something for everyone, you're meaning not just for the required privacy officer within an organisation?
Yeah, that's right. There is a meme, a kind of a story where once a year the privacy officer walks into the boardroom and gives their report, or once a year the audit and risk committee of an organisation prepares their report and gives it on legislation compliance, and a chunk of that is about privacy. I want privacy to be much more than that. I want the governance and the senior leadership of organisations to be actively thinking about privacy as much as they actively think about health and safety, as much as they actively think about the development of their talent, of the way they run their organisations.
And do you think that, I couldn't agree with you more, do you think that people out there are actually understand what their obligations are, that they've got enough certainty around what's expected of them in certain situations?
I think there is work to be done in that space, and later on perhaps we can talk more about what I call, I guess, the privacy ecosystem. But there is a challenge for this office that this office has and will continue to take up, which is ensuring that there's education and guidance available to people to understand what privacy is and why it's important. But I would like to see a greater emphasis of that throughout organisations, from the top to the bottom. So it's not just the chief executive of a private sector company, but it's those who are the decision makers lower down, those who are the ideas generators in marketing, those who are doing product development, even those who are doing the very important job of actually doing software development, which is required for a lot of online services these days. I would like them, for example, Liz, when they're thinking about software development, to be also thinking about the ethics and the implications for what they're doing in terms of privacy.
Right, so privacy by design.
Absolutely, absolutely, privacy by design. And indeed, that's the sort of thing that can start further back. I know that in some university courses, for example, when you do software development, that questions around ethics, questions around privacy are part of those. Often those are optional courses, I understand. It would be great if actually part of being a student learning software development, learning how to use the sorts of and develop the sorts of tools that you and I and others out there will be increasingly using as we go forward, that they have the opportunity, but also the obligation to actually learn about the importance of privacy as part of that.
Right. So is this what you mean by talking about the privacy ecosystem then?
Yeah. I was reading a really interesting paper put together by this office about the sorts of organizations and entities that are involved in the privacy world. And I could see that it was what I'd call, probably what others already know about, as a privacy ecosystem. And if you think about it, as all ecosystems are of concentric rings, there's us, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. There's those who develop policy in the area of privacy, because we are the regulator. Others prepare the policy. There are citizens, of course, the individuals, and then there are the agencies. Beyond that, there's a group of other NGOs, for example. I should give a shout out to NetSafe Week at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Net Safety Week.
There's Māori organisations, there's other regulators playing in that field. And increasingly, there's a large group of people who have the skills and abilities to advise others on privacy, provide guidance, advice, legal advice, whatever there might be. Beyond that, of course, there is Parliament, which makes the laws. Other regulators that, Liz, you know that we deal with here, that in carrying out their roles actually impact on the world of privacy as well. There are foreign regulators as well, because increasingly we're in an interconnected world, and it's important that we bear in mind what's happening in other places. And I think about all those entities, and I think about the promise and the potential for us all to work even more effectively together to actually do more with this thing we call privacy, in terms of supporting each other to prepare advice and guidance, to encourage education in that space. You and I, we work for what is quite a small office here. We paint on a pretty broad canvas with a small number of people. We can one-to-one provide advice to an agency, an organisation out there. But if we prepare guidance and advice, and then make that available to what I call the privacy ecosystem out there, then there's much more opportunity for that IP, for that knowledge, advice, experience to be shared with many more people, that multiplier effect.
Right. Okay. So that's do you see that as being a bit of a shift then, from a sort of more of a focus on a one-to-one to a one-to-many type approach as part of your vision for the organisation and the sort of working with the ecosystem?
I think it's going to be an increasing focus. I think it's important that we all acknowledge that privacy at the end of the day is about the individual, and we can talk more about that. And this office will always care about the individual in terms of the complaints that we receive from people, the complaints we receive about privacy being breached, and the hurt and harm that's done. But increasingly, we will focus on how we can deploy our resources to reach a greater audience with every activity and action we take.
Okay. And have you got some examples of where we've actually taken, so obviously there will always be the focus on the individual, as you say, and the complaints part of our organisation really does focus in hard on privacy harms in that space. We've got some examples of where you've seen us working in a sort of a one-to-many type approach that you think might be an indication of where we might be going in the future.
One that occurs to me, because I was reading the paper the other day, is the what we call the position paper we did, Liz, on biometrics, where we looked at that whole emerging area of biometrics, which includes things like facial recognition software, the way that our physical characteristics, people obviously associate that with our faces, but these days it could go anywhere, I understand. Liz, it could be even how you walk,
how you smell.
It's extraordinary where that's all going. So we did a position paper on that. And what that paper did was it went through what is biometrics, what could it mean for privacy, and then set out a really useful set of questions and thoughts for consideration against the information privacy principles in the Privacy Act, about the sorts of things that we would expect and encourage agencies active in that biometric space to be actively thinking about.
Yeah.
And I understand, Liz, that our next steps with that paper are to review it, assess how the environment has further developed since we first did that, and consult broadly with the community, including the privacy ecosystem that I talked about, to seek their views on where we should go next with that sort of paper. But that's exactly the sort of paper that can provide guidance, advice, and clear expectation setting by this office about what we expect to see in terms of the protection of privacy.
Absolutely. Do you think, in terms of the vision that you've got for us working with agencies, setting those expectations, etc., that we've actually got the tools and resources necessary to do the job? What do you think?
I think that the new Privacy Act, and I say new, even though it passed in 2020, because it is still in early days, includes a very useful array of tools. And we have the ability to do things all the way from advice and encouragement to actually compliance, as you know. It's how we deploy those tools and how we work with other agencies that I think is the critical thing. And it might actually be, at the end of the day, Liz, that actually writing a letter or having a meeting with an agency gets exactly the same result that we want from acting in a slightly more enforcement, heavy-handed approach. And so we, as an office, will always make judgments about how we use those tools. But we have quite a few tools in our toolbox.
We do.
And there is always the potential to use them if we need to. I think that's the important thing that agencies need to understand, that we want to work with them to achieve positive outcomes, and we have in a number of sectors to date, particularly when there have been breaches or there are signs of systemic failure. But at the end of the day, we reserve the right to use the more enforcement-related tools that we have.
Yeah, there was actually, I'm starting to see the questions coming through here, and we did have one which effectively was saying, how do you feel about working with an organisation, i.e. making it clear what your expectations are, and then at the same time, that same organisation could be the subject of an investigation down the track. Do you think that there's a tension there? How do you feel about that?
I think, I wonder, perhaps, Liz, if the best example of that might be the rental sector work we did recently. And again, you would know more about this, given this is week 4 for me. But I think that was an example of a really successful initiative to work with, but make clear to those in the sector the powers the office had, depending on where things went with that. So, in a nutshell, and people I think might be familiar with this, particularly the people who are watching this today, we noticed, and it came to our attention, that in the rental sector, there was excessive requests for information from potential tenants of a nature and style of questioning that seemed to be quite unrelated to the sorts of questions you needed to ask as landlords or agents for landlords. And so we went through a process of working with all the stakeholders in that area, both potential tenants, representative organisations, those representing landlords, and developed some guidance and advice in that sector. We introduced reporting to keep a track on what's happening, and we've got a compliance and enforcement approach where we're following up to ensure that the commitments that were given to change the nature of how things were happening in that sector has actually been worked through. And Liz, you might be able to update me on where that's going next.
Well, actually, one of the parts of the compliance strategy is about one of the things we did in the space was we actually made the compliance strategy transparent to the sector. And so we did go and have a look at application forms and how they're being used, and we've seen some really great changes in behaviour. The other part of the compliance strategy was that we said that we were going to do some mystery shopping and actually get some information about how things were actually happening on the ground. We're just about to get those results in. We've been working with Consumer New Zealand on that, and it'll be interesting just to see what they tell us. But again, that additional intelligence will help us to take just those steps you've been talking about, working with the sector, encouraging them to lift their game by making the expectations really clear and then following through from there. So, yeah.
And so you see there, Liz, as you say, the working with, but you also see the office being vigilant to see that real change, as promised, happens.
Absolutely. I've got another question here, which goes to working with agencies in terms of for the example that's here is the health reforms. So here you've got a situation where you've got the new Health New Zealand and the Māori Health Authority have just been set up. They've taken on responsibility for a whole range of legacy privacy risks and other things, as well as everything else that they're doing. Do you see us having a role working with entities like this when they're actually grappling with what sort of systems to have, how to set this up, and how does that fit with your vision for the office?
Absolutely. One option is to observe, simply to observe Health New Zealand, Māori Health Authority, to see whether they actually take privacy seriously, that as they bring IT systems, information systems together, that privacy is a key component and considerations around that. I don't think that's necessarily the best option, Liz. I think the best option is for us to reach out to Health New Zealand as a stakeholder in their world and say, as the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, we have a strong interest in you succeeding in the area of privacy, because that's important for your customers, your clients, your people who access health services, and it's just as important for us as a representative of those people in terms of their rights to privacy, the rights for their personal information to be protected and respected. And so I would expect us to engage with them as a key stakeholder, to raise the privacy flag with them, and to encourage them as part of their overall risk management approach, as part of their overall information systems approach, right the way up to as part of their overall senior governance and leadership approach, to make privacy something that's at the heart of what they have to do. I fully acknowledge that for the heads of that organisation, there are 1,000,001 important things that they've got to think about. But privacy is something that's very inextricably intertwined with trust. And organisations work best, and sometimes only work, when they have the trust of the people that access their services. And trust is something that we build up over time, Liz, as you know, and trust is incredibly easy to lose. And as we've seen with data breaches, it only takes one significant data breach to actually completely undermine the trust and confidence of people in your organisation. And so I would be saying to the health agencies that this is an area where you can maintain or lose trust depending on the actions you take. And we'll do our very best to work with you to help you to ask yourselves the questions that you need to answer to ensure you have a solid privacy framework.
And also, I guess, one of the things that I know that the Health New Zealand and the Māori Health Authority have been thinking about is the importance in today's world of digital health. And of course, digital health will make use of more personal information. It'll be that'll be part of how you actually achieve greater efficiencies, which brings us back to that sort of IT and technology world, and how we actually get the innovation as well as the trust.
That's right. And you know, we're not Luddites here. You know,
No.
there are absolute advantages to be gained from the careful application of information technology, of data transformation to the delivery of services, to the benefits of all of us. It's how that's done, the questions we ask ourselves, the risk management we carry out behind the scenes in doing that. For example, there are lots of in this space, I think, you can, but should you questions, you know, you can make the data of an organization open to everyone who works within that organization, but should you can, as employees of that organization, access data, but should you, if it's not part of your role, don't do it. These are very simple, I guess, principles through which to work and to run your organizations. And I think they're things that those working in that digital transformation space will increasingly need to spend time, energy, and effort thinking about and coming up with good, solid answers to.
And do you think that one of the things we found recently when we did our 2-yearly survey of public perceptions of privacy was that on the one hand, it looked as if people basically were saying their concerns about privacy had diminished somewhat, but back to the levels of 2001. But when you dug below the surface, actually what they were saying was, I am really concerned about what people are doing with my personal information, about whether it's being on-sold. Do you think that we've done enough to really raise individuals' awareness of what's being done with their data? And then, you know, building from that, how are we going to be more vigilant ourselves about this in the future?
I think that the results, in a sense, demonstrate that point. The more people understand about what's happening with their personal information, the more organizations are transparent about how well they are managing, stewarding that information, those sorts of questions about access, control, deletion if not required. The more that information is out there, the more people therefore understand about the sense of solidity, or indeed the sense of fragility about the integrity and management of that information. And so I'm not surprised people feel that way, because people are now better educated. And I think that's a plus. I think it's a plus that people have a greater understanding about what happens with their personal information when they give that up in return for services from an organization. I think what agencies face now is the challenge of them providing the other side of that, which is the assurance about how well that personal information is being stewarded, looked after, cared for, protected.
Yeah, I've got a question here, which is about the use of social media by government departments and private sector agencies. And what they're referring to here is the use of comments that people make through social media as a sort of research tool to inform policy and communication strategies and what have you. Are you thinking of, as it says here, issuing any guidance on the collection and use of that type of information? I know we started working on it a little while ago, thinking about it, but what's your view?
As always, I guess, for me, the important thing is that there is clarity and transparency about what happens when you interact with any system, whether it's government or private sector. People need to have full information about what happens to what they share. And I think there's absolutely always a role for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner to encourage that sort of behaviour, those sorts of messages in that space, to make expectations clear. It is one of the principles that people need to know while information is being asked from them and what it will be used for. And I think it's incumbent on us to re-emphasize those points to those active in the space.
Great. Okay. I'm just going to ask you a question, which was one that was asked of me when I was acting Privacy Commissioner. But it's come up a couple of times here, so I am going to ask it. You're not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. What do you think that means for you in this role? I mean, the previous incumbent was one. The Marie Schroff wasn't. What is it? What do you think? Effectively, one person says here, is it a strength to not actually have a legal background?
Well, this actually gives me an excellent opportunity. Thank you, whoever asked that question. An excellent opportunity to give a shout out to the office here, Liz, the people we work with. There is an extraordinary team of professional and dedicated and highly committed people here, many of whom are lawyers or have legal training. And so you and I have the ability to access highly professional legal advice if we need to. There is, as part of that privacy ecosystem out there, quite a lot of lawyers are members of that.
Absolutely.
And they enjoy interacting with us and giving us advice. I think that we have the ability to access that sort of professional advice when we need to. I also enjoy working in an office where there's a rounded set of skills that people bring different perspectives to bear. In many ways, for example, the office is to use a phrase, a modern regulator. So actually an understanding of regulation, the theories and models of regulation is important as well, which we'll probably get from a study of economics rather than a study of the law.
Potentially, that's right. And ultimately, it is about the people, isn't it? You know?
It is very much about the people, and you and I get to work with a great bunch of people here.
We certainly do. When you were talking about the key issues facing the organisation, and I mean we keep coming back to this time and time again. There is a question that's come up here around again the digital environment, and it goes to the extent to which you think that you know, in this Net Safety Week, children are safe in this online environment, and whether we've got a role to play in terms of children's privacy. What would be your view be there?
Absolutely. And I think, for example, it's obvious to all of us that there are some social media platforms that are literally taking off like rockets with the use by children and younger New Zealanders. And I think there's a couple of important messages for us in our interactions with the people who lead and manage those organizations. Many of them are obviously, we all know what we're talking about, huge multinational companies. But if they have a presence in New Zealand, they are covered by the New Zealand Privacy Act.
They absolutely
and
are.
they have to act in a way that is consistent with principles of the New Zealand Privacy Act. And they understand that. But it's, I think, incumbent on us to continue to have conversations with them about what that means and to ask them, beyond understanding that, what are you going to do about that? And increasingly, given the reach of those social media platforms into the world of children and younger people, what are they doing to protect the privacy of children and younger people in relation to the obligations on them under the New Zealand Privacy Act?
Okay. One of the things I was going to ask you earlier is whether there's, you know, anything interesting or even surprising to you having just come into this office, things that you didn't occur to you that, for example, the office did before you arrived.
That whole concept of the privacy ecosystem was one of those. Not so much surprising, perhaps not so much interesting, but quite in some ways confronting. I think it was the point I made earlier, Liz, about privacy actually at the end of the day being about individuals, being about people. Part of working here is hearing stories about complaints of individuals who have privacy breach, have suffered a privacy breach, and they complain to our office here. They explain what's happened to them, and then we work with them and the agencies concerned on that. And it's the effects of those breaches that I found quite confronting was the word I used, quite sad in some cases. There are stories of harm, there are stories of loss, there are stories of hurt. There are, frankly, even stories of significant suffering through people who have suffered breaches of their personal privacy. And it's a credit to this organisation and to the nature of the privacy regulatory framework we have in New Zealand that we take those stories seriously and we investigate them fully and we follow up on those complaints and try to ensure that there is a fair resolution for them.
No, I agree. When I first came here too, the confronting nature of what privacy harm can do to individuals and their families, and the legacy of that can stay with an individual for some time. I think is quite a big, was quite confronting for me too. The one area that we've also got questions about relate to the mandatory data breach power that we have, and whether you're seeing that actually the requirement for agencies to report to us is actually having the sort of impact that we were hoping it would have, or not. I mean, I know you're only four weeks in, but what's your view of that so far?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, my understanding is that there was a bit of a uplift in reporting, and there is reporting going on. It's, as you say, mandatory reporting in cases where people think there might have been cases of serious harm. I don't think we're yet getting the full and comprehensive picture. Liz, I think we need to ask the question, are we getting all the reporting that we should be getting? I think agencies need to both understand what's required of them, but then they also need to ensure they have the appropriate systems in place to actually make that a thing that works. And I would encourage them if they want, and I would encourage them all to reach out and actually seek advice about how best to fulfill the requirements of that act. At the end of the day, it's a statutory requirement on them. It's just as much as a statutory requirement as other statutory requirements that they face as agencies, and needs to be taken just as seriously.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. The one of the things that I think you've got the opportunity to do right now is there are large parts of the privacy ecosystem who are listening to us here today.
Right.
And this is your first Privacy Live. I'm sure it'll be the first of many. But are you planning to get out and meet with different parts of the ecosystem over the next while?
Absolutely. One of the exciting things about taking up this role is the sheer sense of energy there is about privacy. Privacy can be seen as a narrow thing. It's just one subject, but actually it has incredible depth and lots of layers to it. And I'm enjoying the meetings I've had so far with stakeholders in this place. I'm looking forward to meeting with the representatives, the heads of agencies that are active in this space, which includes representatives of the big social media companies, as much as it includes meeting with those in government who have an interest in the policy and regulatory environment for privacy. I'm looking forward to meeting with those who have an interest in individuals and the impact that it has on them in terms of privacy. I'm looking forward to meeting with iwi to consider the Te Ao Māori perspective on privacy. There are lots and lots of opportunities. And so far, looking at the invitations that have come in, it shows that there is quite an incredible level of energy in the privacy regulation space, the privacy policy space, which personally I find very exciting for this office, and a really healthy sign for New Zealand.
Yeah, I agree. The invitations were coming in even before you started. And I know that in the very near future, you're going to have the opportunity, as somebody's referenced down here in my questions, to meet with some of the social media platforms, the heads or the contacts from some of the social media platforms. What sort of expectations are you going to, what are you going to say to them?
I think the bottom line will be just to return to something I said earlier, Liz, is that they're active here. Therefore, they are actually governed by New Zealand's regulatory regime for privacy, and they need to understand, and we need to talk to them about what that means, not just in theory, but in practice going forward.
You and I both have kids. And at some point in the future, who knows, we might have mokopuna. But when you think about the legacy that you want to leave for your kids and for your grandkids potentially in the future from a privacy perspective, what do you think about?
At its fundamental, personal information, my information, your information, the information of all the people who have joined us here today is a taonga that absolutely deserves to be protected and respected by everybody who we interact with as citizens of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And so, and OPC and the people out there have a role to play in making sure that happens.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to the next bit of that journey.
Okay, well, I'm going to start wrapping us up now in terms of the PrivacyLive. I do want to join with Michael in having a bit of a shout out to NetSafe. It is Net Safety Week this week, and we're really conscious of the fact that that NetSafe are a partner. And one of the points that Michael was making was that, you know, if we want to achieve good safety outcomes, privacy outcomes online, then we need to work together to achieve those. So our mihi to our colleagues at NetSafe. But for those of you who've been part of this PrivacyLive, I just wanted to thank you for your participation, for the questions that have come through thick and fast. Any of those that we haven't been able to get to today, we will come back to. Also just remind you that in the coming weeks, we'll have another PrivacyLive coming up. This one is looking at gender issues with respect to privacy. So my encouragement to you to look out for that one. I'm looking forward to facilitating another panel conversation there. But from Michael and I hope this has given you the opportunity to get to know our new Privacy Commissioner a little more. Look out for him in the coming weeks, because he will be getting out there across the privacy ecosystem and getting to meet more of you. But from me today, ngā mihi, take care, enjoy the remainder of your week, stay safe, and mā te wā.